Do diversity trainings even really work? That's the topic we'll be addressing on this episode of Healthy Schmelthy, music courtesy the electronic artist Monster Rally, who hails from Ohio. You can get their Tropicali electronic music at all the streaming services and at monsterrally.bandcamp.com. Welcome to Healthy Schmelthy, the podcast using humor and curiosity to sort through healthcare so you can stop getting schmelthy and start getting healthy. Thank you for listening. On this episode, we'll be talking about the issue of diversity trainings and how efficient they are. And to help me talk about that, I've invited my esteemed guest, Mary Frances Winters, founder of the Winters Group. That's a global diversity and inclusion firm. They do a lot of consulting with companies and organizations about how they're addressing diversity and inclusion. So she's done a lot of great work. She has a lot of thoughts about this topic, and she's written a research paper, actually. And that's how I came across Mary Frances Winters. So in addition to the group, she's also the author of 3 books, including 2017's We Can't Talk About That at Work. And stay tuned at the end of this episode after the interview that I had with Mary Frances Winters. I'll fill you in on what's the top healthcare news. I'll be bringing that to you courtesy myself and some lovely friends who I've asked to come along the way. Asked or possibly forced, but you'll hear that at the end. So yeah, the question that we're talking about is, do diversity trainings even really work? You know, those HR trainings and those sessions and cultural bias sessions and stuff that work makes you go through once a year. Show notes for this episode can be found at rishibi.com, where I'll put links to some research papers and articles that we mention in our conversation, but also links to the music of Monster Rally. Thank you so much, Monster Rally, for the music. And here is my conversation with Mary Frances Winters. Starting off, can you tell me and my listeners about your background and your organization, the Winters Group?
Yeah, so absolutely. So yeah, the company has been in business now for 34 years. We actually celebrated our 34th anniversary last Friday. So I was in the corporate world for a few years and decided that as a woman of color, I was seeing all sorts of things that we now call unconscious biases, but back then we didn't have a language for them. So sure. I decided to launch my own firm and have been dedicated ever since to supporting individuals and organizations in understanding that there are differences that make a difference. And when we are understanding of those differences and can practice empathy, we actually can create inclusive environments that work for more that work for more people. I don't know what it's like to be you. You don't know what it's like to be me, but we make assumptions that it's the same. And so when we can begin to understand how external events, impact people, for example, I was working with an organization and a young man who had been impacted by Black Lives Matter. Somebody had been killed. A young black man had been killed the day before. And he said he went to his boss to get the boss asked, so what's going on? Are you okay? And then he didn't get anything. He didn't get, I'm not feeling well, or this has happened, or, he didn't get anything from the boss in terms of any kind of empathy or anything. So that impacts somebody's well-being, that impacts their health. He ended up leaving that organization. There are lots of people today, lots of individuals and identity groups that are feeling threatened and they're bringing those feelings obviously into the workplace, not knowing the support they might get or not, but it impacts their health. And so we're working now a lot with helping organizations to understand how the external and the socio-political climate is impacting others, and to enhance their capability for empathy.
Oh, that's great. My next question, actually, so I just wanted to give you a compliment that you're very on topic, that you're very on message, rather, because my next question, I was going to read back to you your organization's mission that I got from the website, but you just almost word for word reiterated that just now. So, so good job of being on message. For yourself personally, you were saying that you're celebrating your 34th anniversary. What was there something or any events specific to you that drove you to create the organization?
Yes. So in the big corporate world, as an African American woman, I experienced sexual harassment. I experienced being ignored. I experienced not being taken seriously. Even, I literally used to go home and cry every night after work because I just felt, I just felt frustrated that I wasn't being heard. I wasn't being listened to. Actually, I was doing very well at the company. They sent me through an executive program for my MBA. I was the only person of color that they had ever sent. And when I got back from that, the work that I was doing was really still like a glorified administrative assistant. I got to go to executive meetings, but in those meetings, my role was to get the coffee and to, make sure that the notebooks were in order and those kinds of things, even after having, this advanced degree. So that's what really prompted me to, to leave the organization, because I think, it did impact. It was stressful. Yeah. And I felt that in the performance reviews that I would get, one boss would tell me that I was too aggressive. The next boss would tell me that I'm not aggressive enough. And so this, sort of these evaluations that were, to me, had a lot of, bias, in them based on who they were looking at. Right.
For sure.
So I thought, well, gee, if I'm not going to succeed in life, it's not going to be because somebody else is telling me my capabilities or what I can do. If I'm not going to succeed in life, it's going to be because I personally didn't work hard enough. Right. So that's why I decided to go out on my own and say, this is going to be my passion. This is going to be what I do to support others. So I do a lot of mentoring of other young people who are now 30 some years later still finding that many workplaces are still toxic.
Okay. Yeah. For sure. Yeah, I've just personally myself, I'm the only non-white person in my team, and I never really thought that would mean anything, but it definitely means something.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I say, differences make a difference, right?
Right, for sure. So I totally empathize with what you're saying with that. I'm so sorry for your work experience. But let's cut forward a little bit. I mentioned that I first caught wind of you from a mention of your retrospective study that you did of corporate diversity trainings. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and what that paper was about?
Yeah, so actually it's a few years old now, but the idea was that there's a lot of criticism about diversity training and that it doesn't work. As a matter of fact, the article that you saw in Time was written by a woman who was saying that my position in writing that article supported her position that diversity training doesn't work. And that isn't really not what I was saying at all. What I was saying is that diversity training not done well doesn't work. And so I like to look at this as a competency.
Sure.
And to become competent in anything, you need to practice and you need to work at it. Diversity training is often positioned as a one and done. We just got off the phone with a potential client who said, gee, can you come in 2 hours and do unconscious bias training in 2 hours? That's what I call the one and done. It's not going to change behaviors. It's not going to change worldviews.
Right.
And so, we look at it from an educational perspective. You want to educate because training can build skills, but education changes mindsets. And what we're really trying to do, I think, is change mindsets. The retrospective was that we had come from the 60s where it was primarily just compliance training. How do you stay out of trouble with, the EEOC and the laws that have been enacted to protect certain groups, to more of a sensitivity and awareness. But we were still lacking in this bringing it to more of a competency-based approach, where it would be developmental, meaning that you start at where people are and you move forward. I liken it to a placement test in college. If I've already had 4 semesters of Spanish, when I'm going into college, I take a placement test, and I may not have to take Spanish 101. I can probably go into more advanced Spanish.
Sure.
We need to look at this work in the same way, because we're asking people to understand very complex concepts around difference that they're not ready to understand. So we say that you need to start initially with self-awareness, cultural self-awareness, and recognizing that everybody has a culture. Oftentimes, particularly heterosexual white men don't see themselves as having a culture. So we've got to do that work first. Before we can start having you delve into some of these more complex kinds of concepts.
Yeah.
So there's a process. So my point in that article was no, diversity training doesn't work if you approach it as a one and done. However, if you look at it as a competency and you develop the education as you would any other competency, then indeed it does work. And we have evidence that it works from clients with whom we've worked in that way.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I read the Time magazine article just a couple of days ago. I reread that just for reference again after I read your paper that you did, and I noted the same thing, that they seem to be quoting your paper quite a bit throughout the article, but then they're jumping to this conclusion that diversity trainings are no longer necessary, which was not what your paper was saying.
Not at all.
Yeah. So I noted that same thing. So don't be afraid, that people are connecting you to that. You touched a little bit about the evolution or the history of diversity trainings. As you were saying, the diversity trainings in the corporate sense kind of became a thing per the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But then it sort of came to mean different things in the 80s and 90s. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit about that, like how it sort of evolved over time.
Right. Yeah. So over time, it became less of about, here's the law, here's what you can do and you can't do. Here's a list of things. Now learn this list of things. Now go back to your office and don't do this and do this. Right.
Right.
And then long about in the 80s, leaders began to recognize that it's not so easy as a cookbook, because these issues were pretty, complex. And so what they really started to look at was more, we need to figure out a way to get along. We need to figure out a way to understand these differences a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But still, even then, it was just like, okay, you need to be aware that women are coming, into the workplace, and they've been socialized differently than men. And so they may have a different worldview or prioritize certain things differently. Right.
Right.
Very surface level. So a lot of the work then might have been, we're going to have a cultural fair where we're going to have people wear their cultural garb, or they're going to, we're going to bring in food, from different cultures. And so it was very surface, very, very much. It didn't take people into any uncomfortable places. Everybody likes to eat, right? Everybody likes to dress up, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so then, I think it moved from a mindset of, it's about us getting along to, there's a business case here. And the business case is that, we have diverse customers, and those diverse customers, we need to understand them. And so how do we better understand, our diverse customers so that we can, sell more product? So that was the market-based argument. But then there was also an argument that said, we're trying to attract and retain a workforce, and the workforce is becoming more diverse. More women are coming into the workforce, more people of color are coming into the workforce, more people, are coming from outside of the United States. We're more global in terms of how we do our work. And so we're going to lose, not only will we lose productivity if we don't have cultural competence, but we're also could be a retention issue. So there became this sort of bottom line argument about diversity and inclusion, which heretofore had been really more about, it's just the right thing to do from a moral perspective. And so, right. And then it became, in order to do that then, and if we're trying to understand different markets, and we're trying to understand how our different employees, we need to be competent in that. We need to have, so this notion of cultural competence became, popular. And that's the framework that the Winters Group that we use now in terms of doing our work. What are the skills and abilities that you need as a leader or even an individual contributor to be able to effectively work with people who are different from you?
Okay. I read some of the activities with the old style versus the current style of diversity training. I think in the old style, there was these activities called, there was one that was called blue eyes, brown eyes.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk about that and what sort of effect that had?
Well, the woman who started it way back in the 60s separated kids in a classroom based on blue eyes and brown eyes. And then she told the one group one day, she told the blue eyes kids that they were the better kids and they were better than the brown eyes kids. And then the next day she reversed it. But they could see how just by telling the kids that they're better than the other, that the behavior would change. And I still think that's irrelevant. I mean, I think it's still a relevant exercise, and definitely
creating groups.
Well, by helping groups understand what it's like to be the other,
right.
What it's like to be the non-dominant group, what it's like to be, the marginalized group.
Right. Yeah, just for myself personally, sometimes, I'll bring like a friend who's white with me to a cultural gathering, my Indian community. And, for once in their life, there's more Indian people than there is, white people.
Right.
And so then they kind of get that feeling.
We'll be right back with more of my conversation with Mary Frances Winters. Okay, so as Mary Frances Winters and I were talking right before the break, that traditional diversity trainings, there's some rumor and word going around that they no longer have a place in today's society. These trainings that are based off of a model known as unconscious bias training. And Mary Frances Winters some time ago co-authored a research paper, and some people have taken the results of that to mean that exactly that these diversity trainings, unconscious bias training, aren't relevant anymore. However, she's saying that the key thing that we need to realize here is that the institutions who are hosting these bias trainings, they have to look at this training as a competency. It's not just a 2-hour Band-Aid. Something happens and then you just slap someone with a training, one-day training, and that's it. It's a skill that's grown over time, and it's a skill that all of us can learn. Even Mary Frances Winters as a black woman, and even me as a brown guy, if you can believe that. And everyone needs to understand that they have their own cultural identity, even heterosexual white men. So that's it for the recap. Let's get back into my conversation with Mary Frances Winters.
One thing that you mentioned in the paper is white people weren't really regarded as, or white men rather, weren't regarded as having genuine diversity concerns in the old model.
Right.
Can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that? I think that kind of connects to things that we're seeing in politics currently,
Right. Yeah. I think that, the white men would feel that, okay, you're trying to, we're the dominant group. And so what you're trying to do is beat up on us, in other words, to tell us how we have to act, with the non-dominant group. But hey, we're the ones in power, and why do we have to change, right? They should be the ones who have to change. So I think that earlier training left white men feeling that they were the target, and it was all the change. But when we frame this as a competency, everybody needs to be more competent. And so just because I'm an African-American woman doesn't mean that I have an understanding of the Indian culture or the Chinese culture or, any other culture, for that matter.
Sure.
the LGBTQ community. It doesn't mean that. So I need to. So it's kind of like everyone is responsible and has a responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that I liked, and I'm forgetting if I got this from your paper or somewhere else, but I like this idea of evolving diversity trainings and viewing things that separate people between primary and secondary. So primary being the things that you can see, like race and gender, and secondary being like socioeconomic factors and like where were you born and what income level were you born in. I guess just in general, maybe not on that specifically, but in general, do you see companies and people kind of moving towards this cultural competency view of diversity training in general?
No. I think not fast enough because,
Okay.
I think that people are still sort of looking at it as a one item thing. And that one item is unconscious bias. I mean, that's what's popular today. And so everybody's kind of, has sort of taken that up as, this is what we need to focus on.
Mm-hmm. So you were talking about like retention and that kind of thing, like the story that you brought up initially about the individual who didn't really feel like they were being understood with their feelings towards the Black Lives Matter. They ended up leaving the company. Would that be like the primary focus from a corporate perspective about what they can gain from doing these kind of trainings properly? Is just keeping on to their valuable workers? Or
yeah, absolutely. Well, that's one thing, but also being able to attract, because if organizations are in the news and they're in the news in a not so positive way, about inclusive practices, then people are not going to want to work for that organization, right?
Right.
And so it's about attraction, it's about retention. But it's also about customers too, because if you're a consumer organization, then there might be a constituency that says, "Oh wow, look what you did to these, to these employees in this group. I'm not going to buy from this company anymore."
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I guess we're seeing a lot of that right now with with Facebook and stuff like that.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, you see what happened to their stock, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that wasn't necessarily an inclusion issue, but I'm saying those kinds of issues. Any kind of press that would put them in, an organization in a bad light can impact different constituency groups.
For sure. So I didn't realize your company was around for so long. I'd be curious to know if throughout that time, throughout the 34 years, your group has been there. Are there any sort of things that you find to be working better than other things? Are there certain things that you focus on now, or things that you've learned and sort of changed over that time?
A lot of things have changed, but a lot of things have remained the same. I mean, I think I was talking with a group not too long ago, and I was lamenting that a lot of the issues that we were dealing with 34 years ago, we're still dealing with today. And so that was, kind of frustrating for me. But, I think that we have made some progress. And those companies that are really serious about it are seeing the benefits, like a company like Sodexo, which is one of my clients. They've been at this now for, 15, 20 years.
Okay.
They're seeing the benefits on the bottom line. They're seeing the benefits just in terms of the good press that they get and being able to attract. And so it takes, what I've learned is that it really does take persistence, and it does take organizations that are willing to stick with it and not do these stops and starts. I just talked with a client today. We've been doing some work with them, probably over the past 5 years. New leader has come in, don't want to continue it, so they're going to stop now. Right.
Right.
And so, so that really becomes frustrating.
Yeah, actually, in particular about Sodexo, because I think there was a case study that was mentioned in the paper.
Right.
The paper was mentioning that companies who seem to be doing well, they tend to adopt the importance of having a diverse workforce, like in their mission or in their company principles.
That's right.
And you were talking about some of the misconceptions with the Time article. One thing that they said in that was there's a sense of diversity fatigue. And I think that's different than what you're saying with the frustrations of things kind of staying the same. But do you sense that there's this going around in companies now, this diversity fatigue?
Well, I think with the practitioners, those of us who do the work, there's probably some fatigue.
Sure.
But I actually see a renewed interest because of being in the socio-political climate that we're in. Mm-hmm. I'm actually seeing organizations that are reaffirming their commitment.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. Just to kind of bring it back to what you were saying about unconscious bias training. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Again, just hit the point back home on how we're trying to get from differences to being aware of these kind of unconscious things that we have.
Yeah. So I think that, unconscious bias training in and of itself is not good because it needs to be wrapped around this broader concept of competency. It needs to be wrapped around the concept of self and other understanding. So understanding myself, understand my identity, why I believe what I believe, what has created that. Before we jump into this idea of unconscious bias, before I tell you got biases, let me first have you explore and do some work around, cultural self and other understanding.
Sure.
So that's I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying, by itself, it's not necessarily useful.
Okay. Yeah. And corporations, if they get behind this, they'll see it benefit their bottom line, like Sodexo.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time, Mary Frances.
You're very welcome.
So that was my chat with Mary Frances Winters. Stay tuned for more Healthy Schmelthy. Hope everyone enjoyed my conversation with Mary Frances Winters addressing the question, do diversity trainings even really work? And once again, Mary Frances Winters is the founder of the global diversity and inclusion firm, the Winters Group. They've done a lot of interesting work. Like she mentioned, she was talking about some work that the group had done with Sodexo. They've done some trainings and some consulting with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, insurance company right here in my home state of Michigan. And you can find more information about her work and papers that she's associated with and written at the show notes for this episode at rishib.com. And before we move on to the next segment, I was just kind of thinking about this conversation that I had with Mary Frances, and it got me thinking. She was reinforcing this thought that learning to be inclusive is a competency. It's not a one-time thing. And as I was kind of ruminating on that, I tend to ruminate on things. I was thinking about this phrase that I've been hearing a lot recently, particularly from white people primarily, which is, I don't see color. A lot of times it's like, some incident happened, some racial incident happened in the news or something, and someone will tell me, I just don't get it, like how that could happen. I mean, like, take myself, yeah, sure, I'm white, but I just don't see color. And the thing is that's BS. You do see color. Everyone sees color. I mean, everyone, unless you're like, through some Freaky Friday incident, you've been transformed from a dog into a human, and so your eyes only see gray or something. You're living the world as a canine. So unless that's your reality, you do see color. And, the thing is that's okay. It's okay that you see color as long as you're reacting positively. You're not reacting negatively upon observation of color. If you're not crying and pooping your pants the minute you see a brown person, I feel like you're doing pretty good. Obviously you could be doing a little bit more, but let's start there.
and, expand upon that. The thing is that to really confront your inner biases, you need to dig a little deeper than, some trivial, I don't see color. You need to dig deeper. Dig deeper like my man, Frank Zappa. Let's hear what he has to say about the issue of race.
I'm not black, but there's a whole lot of times I wish I could say I'm not white.
Wise words as always, Frank. Thank you very much. Okay, let's fill you in on the top healthcare news of the day, links to which can be found in the show notes for this episode at rishib.com. Recent reports on hundreds of cases of severe lung disease stemming from vaping has turned public health attention on the e-cigarette industry, leading to an announcement the FDA is finalizing a plan to ban all flavored e-cigarettes from the market and requiring tobacco-flavored ones to go through federal review. Asked for comment, e-cigarette lobbyists responded, Nice. Earlier this year, the White House announced an Obamacare replacement plan. However, the lack of details on any such plans have many conservative groups thinking the Trump administration are keeping their focus on the 2020 election and instead drafting a damage control bill should Obamacare be overturned. This comes in light of a Fifth Circuit court case which puts the bill's future in jeopardy. Asked if he had any details on healthcare bills, Trump was heard saying,
Nope.
Asked if he really hates Obamacare, Trump was heard saying,
Yep.
Purdue Pharma, one of the more notorious OxyContin producing pharmaceutical companies in the news in regards to opioid lawsuits, has reached a tentative settlement with 23 states and more than 2,000 local municipalities. This news comes in light of a recent settlement the company made with the state of Oklahoma, which amounted to $270 million. Well, that was the news. Do you feel informed, listener? What about you, 2 Chainz? Do you feel informed now?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. How about you, Flava Flav? Any thoughts on the opioid crisis? Interesting. Well, I guess that's going to do it for this episode of Healthy Schmelthy. Make sure you tweet me, find me on Twitter, RishiB, or email therishib@gmail.com. Make sure you just subscribe to Healthy Schmelthy via whatever podcatcher you're using, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, whatever, Google Play. I'm there. Healthy Schmelthy is there. Make sure you subscribe and leave a review. That's very much appreciated. Once again, the music for this episode was brought to you by the electronica Tropicalia artist Monster Rally. And with that, I'm going to bid you all adieu, and let's get out of here with some more Monster Rally. Bye-bye now.